All right, we are live, Larry.
Great, thank
Got it
you.
working, so we should be good to go. Apologies to our viewers who are waiting and expecting us to go live right on the dot at 8 Eastern. We're just a minute late or so.
Yeah,
But I'm glad we got it figured out. We're dealing with new technology to our viewers / listeners, so that's always a precarious proposition to begin with. But here we are.
absolutely. And I know nothing of technology, so I'm totally in your hands.
Well, we'll see how this goes. You know, that's we've got the toughest part behind us, I think, with getting things started. But hopefully it continues well. How
All
are
right.
you, Larry? How are things in northern Pennsylvania?
Things in northern Pennsylvania are great. We had our first real significant snowstorm of the year the other day, about 5 inches, and it's
All
been
right.
very, very cold, but it's winter.
I am glad to hear that you finally have some snow. We had, I don't know if this was the same in Pennsylvania. I suspect that it was, but we had here in the Chicago area, we had a record, maybe not broken, but I think this is the longest we had gone without measurable snowfall in something like 100 years. And then it finally
Yeah,
happened. So,
yeah, I read that. Yes, it was the same here. We had no snow in November, December, nothing, and through most of January. And I
well,
hate winter, so that's fine by me.
yeah, I totally agree with you. I'm definitely a warm weather person, not a huge
Yeah,
fan
me
of
too.
winter. But my thinking, Larry, is if you're going to have the cold, you might as well have some beautiful snow to blanket it. So I don't mind it when the snow
Yeah.
comes.
My thinking is snow is the invention of Satan, and I'd rather not have any of it.
Okay, well, this got serious real quick. Uh,
I hate it.
so
I just hate it.
Well, thanks to all of our viewers who are tuning into the live stream, and we'll probably have a few more trickle in as we get started. And I will be monitoring the chat window as we go. If you'd like to join the chat, just hit subscribe. I think I limited the chat to subscribers so that I would have no spam bots hitting the chat. So just hit subscribe on the YouTube, and then you should be able to join the chat from there. But we'll take questions as we go from the chat. While we wait for some questions to trickle in, Larry, let's start with a question that I had from a listener after our last conversation. A listener wrote to me. I answered him with some of my thoughts over email, but I can share them here as well. But a listener wrote to me and said, "Hey Zach, I am in a Protestant denomination, but I'm thinking about becoming Catholic, and in particular, I'm attending when I can an Anglican Ordinariate parish near me. I would like to, if I become Catholic, I would like to attend one of these because this parish in particular is really serious about liturgy, and the folks there seem wonderful. It seems like a great parish community to be a part of, and I would love to do that. But you and Larry had said on your last podcast that you don't think Traditionis Custodes really has big implications for the Eastern Rite churches and for the Anglican Ordinariate. And he was asking, why is that? So why, Larry, do we think that what Pope Francis has done with the traditional Latin Mass does not really have implications for what could happen to the Eastern churches and to the Ordinariate?
Well, I mean, that's a complex question. First off, I can't prognosticate anything, especially with regard to this papacy. Anything is possible. But let's start with the Eastern Rite Catholics. I mean, Eastern Rite Catholics are sort of in a zone, protected, that's all their own. There's just no way that Rome is going to move against Eastern Rite liturgies because the preservation of those liturgies is the very reason why they've sort of agreed to, be in union with Rome and not part of Orthodoxy. I think the chances that Rome is going to try and suppress Eastern Rite liturgies is less than zero. It would drive them right into the Orthodox fold, and there's absolutely no justification for it either because it doesn't impinge upon the Roman Rite in any way, shape, or form. Now, the Anglican usage rite is considered, a form of the Roman Rite, and it potentially could come under, the radar of Pope Francis and his desire to unify the Roman Rite all under the Novus Ordo, all under a single rite. But I think that also is highly unlikely. The chances aren't zero, but very, very unlikely. reason number one are the ecumenical implications of the Ordinariate. Pope Francis is a very ecumenically minded pope, and he understands that the Ordinariate is a pathway into the church for many Protestants, and not just Anglicans, but any Protestant. And I think he's very, very open to that. Also, the Anglican rite usage is extremely small. Your emailer is very fortunate, actually, that he has a Ordinariate Rite church near him.
Yeah, agreed.
And as am I. I have one very, very near to me, and a great one that has its own standalone church. It's not a liturgy within, a Novus Ordo parish where you have to sort of carve out your own time. No, we have a professional choir, everything. And so we're very fortunate here. But, there just aren't that many Ordinariate parishes. They don't make that big of a splash. Although the bishop of the North American Ordinariate, Bishop Stephen Lopes, was just named the head of the liturgy committee for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And he won that position by one vote, 121 to 120, I think. And I think in some ways that was the American bishops wishing to send a signal to Rome that they value and prize the Ordinariate liturgy here in the United States very much. Finally, one of the problems with the traditional Latin Mass, and let's be honest here, is that around that Latin Mass had coalesced a certain number of traditionalists. I don't know the number, all right? It's certainly not a majority of them, but a loud minority of people had coalesced around the traditional Latin Mass who were very, very critical of Vatican II, the new Mass, the Mass of Paul VI and the Novus Ordo, very, very critical of Pope Francis. There are traditionalists who openly have published statements that they think Pope Francis is a heretic. And so there's been an agitation in the traditional Latin Mass movement that has fostered a certain church within a church, a sort of remnant mentality that was us against the Pope. And I think Pope Francis had enough of that agitation. And none of that agitation exists in the Ordinariate. Maybe, I shouldn't say none, maybe a little. But it's a very, very insignificant thing. People who attend Ordinariate parishes are not ideologically opposed to Vatican II or Pope Francis or any of that sort of stuff. So I think that your emailer is very safe, and I think the Ordinariate is very safe. I might have to eat my words 6 months from now, a year from now, but I just don't see any movement from Rome, hear any rumors from Rome, any gossip from Rome that something on the Ordinariate is in the offing. I just don't see it.
Yeah, your comments just now, Larry, touched on most of what I had responded to this emailer with. I'll just add a couple of quick thoughts. One, to your point about the Ordinariate being fundamentally different, the people in the Ordinariate, especially the priests who were Anglican priests and are now Catholic priests, they became Catholic priests distinctively and very deliberately in an effort to enter into union with Rome. So there's no sort of rebellious aspect of the move whatsoever, and I think that's why the Ordinariate is safe. As you mentioned, Pope Francis is very ecumenically minded, and in that sense, the Anglican Ordinariate is an ecumenical movement of Rome, and all the priests who have entered into it are saying, we want to be in union with Rome. That's why we are entering into this Ordinariate. We want to keep our Anglican traditions, but we are really intentional and deliberate about wanting to enter into communion with Rome. And then the second thing is, as you are well aware, Larry, the Second Vatican Council explicitly affirmed the Eastern churches. So obviously didn't talk about the Ordinariate because it didn't exist by then. But in Orientalium Ecclesiarum, it says, and I'm just going to read from my email back to this person who was, and I'm not using this name because I don't know how much privacy he wants to maintain. But to the person who emailed me, I said, this is the quote from paragraph 6 of Orientalium Ecclesiarum. All members of the Eastern Rite should know and be convinced that they can and should always preserve the legitimate liturgical rite and their established way of life, and that these may not be altered except to obtain for themselves an organic improvement. All these then must be observed by the members of the Eastern Rites themselves. Besides, they should attain to an ever greater knowledge and a more exact use of them, and if in their regard they have fallen short owing to contingencies of times and persons, they should take steps to return to their ancestral traditions. So that's what the Second Vatican Council said about the Eastern churches. It explicitly affirmed them, and And I think that sort of makes it so that there'd be legitimate, I think, juridical questions about whether or not Pope Francis could press them.
Yeah, and I think that's all true. A couple more points, and I think that's very true, actually, and that's a good point, that's ensconced right there in Vatican II, which Pope Francis, is a big supporter of. But with regard to the Ordinariate, two points that need to be made. One in favor of the fact that I think it's safe, and one that maybe it's not so safe. One is that if you look at the actual form and structure of the Ordinariate liturgy, unlike the traditional Latin Mass, the Ordinariate liturgy is in the vernacular. It's in the language of the people. And yes, worship is ad orientem, away from the people, but the prayers are said out loud with dialogical responses. It's a kind of cross between a very traditional liturgy and the Novus Ordo. And so there are elements of it that Pope Francis, I think, would have no problem with whatsoever, that this perfectly good liturgy. I think Pope Francis seems to have a problem with some of the structure of the traditional Latin Mass. It's silent, and it's a language that nobody understands, and so on. But the other thing is this. We mentioned the ecumenical implications of the Ordinariate, and you mentioned that, the clergy have come in explicitly in order to be in union with Rome, and that's a very ecumenical gesture. But there are some liberal Catholics, progressive Catholics, who considered Pope Benedict's creation of the Ordinariate an unecumenical gesture.
Oh, really? Okay.
They considered it to be a kind of slap in the face to the Anglican Church, because a lot of the people that wanted to move away from Anglicanism
I see what you're saying, right?
And into the Roman Catholic Church were essentially disgruntled Anglicans. That they opposed the ordination of women. They certainly opposed the consecration of female bishops. They opposed gay marriage and the blessing of same-sex unions. The whole 9 yards, the whole liberal progressive path that the Church of England has gone down. And so, there are actually some Catholic bishops in the UK who really were not happy with Pope Benedict for, in a sense, creating a new atmosphere in which there might be a little antagonism between the Catholic Church and the mainstream Anglican Church. Now, I just mentioned that as a very, very small thing, but it has to be said that there is that school of thought out there that views the Ordinariate as a kind of slap at the Anglican Church. I don't think Pope Francis thinks that way. I don't think, but he hasn't said anything one way or the other. And with regard to Pope Francis, that's probably a good thing that he hasn't said anything one way or the other.
Yeah, well, we've talked about how Pope Francis really comes from the school of sort of Big Tent Catholicism, and I think personally that the Anglican Ordinariate is safe because of that Big Tent Catholicism. That this is, I think Pope Francis views it as very much in the vein of Big Tent Catholicism, and so there's no real impulse to remove it.
Yeah.
Got a couple of questions and comments here, Larry. Let's go to the first of these. Commenter PX Smith says, Dr. Chapp, with the huge issues with the Russian Orthodox, do you think this will help drive a greater chance of unity with Ukrainian or Alexandrian? So obviously the slightly more background on that for other listeners is there is a not quite de facto schism in the Orthodox Church right now, but there is a significant disagreement between several patriarchs in the Orthodox Church, and the Russian Orthodox are sort of spearheading that division. And the question is, I think, does this help drive a greater chance of unity with the Ukrainian or the Alexandrian rites?
No. I think that it's an opportunity for Rome and Alexandria and Constantinople to cooperate more with one another, to have friendlier and more cordial relations with one another. Rome has always had better relations, at least recently, with Constantinople and Alexandria than it has with Moscow. The trouble is, the Russian Orthodox Church, I think, is like 1/3 of the entire population of Orthodoxy in the world, if not more. So you're dealing with a huge population of the Orthodox in Russia, and that segment of the Orthodox Church is decidedly anti-Roman, and a lot of it has to do with a certain hubris, a certain arrogance. Moscow is the third Rome and all that kind of thing. And nobody gets along with the Russians. The Greeks don't like the Russians, and the Ukrainians certainly don't like the Russians. So there's a lot of disunity. There's a lot of acrimony there. So yeah, maybe you might think, well, maybe that acrimony will reach a boiling point, especially if Russia invades the Ukraine, for crying out loud, and drive, a union with Rome. Well, never distrust the Holy Spirit. Anything is possible, and the Holy Spirit might use this moment to move some hearts, move some souls. But we can't underestimate the level of sort of anti-Roman sentiment that exists in all of Orthodoxy and not just amongst the Russians. That anti-Roman sentiment has softened of late. Pope Francis has spoke primarily of the need in the light of modern secular culture and the common enemies and challenges that we face. He's spoken simply of a greater level of cooperation between the two churches. So I think that he understands that full reunification or intercommunion is probably still not anywhere on the radar. Not unless Rome gives up a lot of its own juridical claims, a lot of its own doctrinal claims. I just don't see the rest of Orthodoxy embracing Roman authority anytime soon.
I'm still studying this issue a lot, Dr. Chapp, but a couple of things that I have sort of questions that I would pose to you. The first is in the course of your own study of theology and of the church, do you have recommendations for reading on people who are looking to just get familiar with the sort of East-West controversy? And the second question is, you just mentioned, the real barriers are Rome giving up its juridical claims and Rome giving up its doctrinal claims. Which of those do you think are bigger? In my reading, it's really the juridical claims that are the bigger ones, and the juridical claims drive what sort of tend to be what drives sort of a magnification of the doctrinal divergences, which are not as significant as they're often made out to be.
Yeah, the doctrinal divergences over things like differing ideas of original sin, differing ideas of Mary's sinlessness,
Right.
When that happens, I should
Right.
say. And those two things are linked, by the way, their notion of original sin and
Right.
immaculate conception. So, yeah, but those can be negotiated. Those are not church dividing issues. When I said doctrinal, I mean basically doctrines with regard to the papacy itself.
Oh, gotcha.
That when the
The
Pope
juridical doctrines, yeah.
yeah, when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, he speaks infallibly for the whole church, that the Pope can enunciate new dogmas on his own authority and that kind of thing. That's a very hard pill for the Orthodox to swallow with their more synodal understanding of authority and their more conciliar notion of authority, quite frankly. But I think you're right. I think overall it's the juridical aspect where Rome claims universal jurisdictional authority over the entirety of the church. And, personally, if I were Pope, and thank God I'm not, but if I were Pope, it would be something that I would consider doing, would be to renounce with regard to the Orthodox my jurisdictional claims over them in the interest of ecclesial unity. I mean, after all, the Orthodox have done fairly well, thank you very much, all on their own without Roman assistance. So intercommunion wouldn't necessarily mean that Rome's got to go rushing in with the rule book and its own canon law, because that would be extremely counterproductive up front. The Orthodox have their own fine way of doing things, and like the West, it's got its dysfunctions too, but we have ours as well. In terms of resources, I'm not actually a scholar on East-West relations. It's not my wheelhouse. But I know that the Dominican theologian Aidan Nichols has written on East-West relations. And I think he is an important resource. And on the Orthodox side, there's a French theologian, Russian Orthodox, Olivier Clément, who's written books on Rome, very sort of favorable towards the notion of Roman primacy with 800 million caveats. But but Clément, Clement, he's written some interesting things on East-West relations as well.
Okay, great. Those are good suggestions. I'm familiar with Aidan Nichols.
Yeah.
And he has this. I forget what it's called. I'll see if I can find a link to it and put it in the comments. But it's a wonderful primer on basically the Eastern churches.
Yeah.
All right, another question. This is from Bruno Geddes. I'm probably mispronouncing the last name, so apologies, Bruno. But Bruno asks, do you feel optimistic about the synod on synodality? Here in Switzerland, in my diocese, the results came in, and about 2/3 of the participants are basically material heretics. That sadly is not surprising, those numbers to me, Larry, but are you optimistic about the synod on synodality, which I can barely say with a straight face, honestly?
No, I am not optimistic about the synod on synodality. Let's just be honest here. I mean, the thing is so ill-defined, it's not even funny. You can say, well, that's why we need a synod on synodality, because we need to define it better. No, I think you need a better set of working principles, theological principles up front that specify quite clearly, here are the goals. Here is the theology that undergirds our thinking. These are the principles that are going to guide us. What we've gotten instead, did you see what the American bishops put out? This list of buzzwords that were supposed to be happy, inclusivity, diversity, open-mindedness, change. There wasn't one mention of Christ, the sacraments, holiness, conversion, nothing.
So bad.
It's all these, you've seen what I'm talking about, right? All of
I
these
definitely have.
corporatist buzzwords that you would get out of a human resources pamphlet. And it's just absurd that this is what's driving the conversation instead of profound Christological and ecclesiological theological principles. Synodality in and of itself is a good thing. It's related to the Second Vatican Council's call for what's called collegiality, which is just a fancy word for shared authority in the church between the bishops and the papacy. Because it is true that there has crept into the Catholic Church over the past 150 to 200 years an over-centralization of power and authority in Rome. There's no reason why, for example, every bishop in the world has to be appointed by a Roman congregation. There's no reason for that. Historically, in the history of the church, local episcopacies and stuff chose their own bishops. Now, Rome can still maintain veto power. That's fine. And that would be a nice Roman way of guaranteeing orthodoxy in the church or whatever. But that's just one example of the hyper-centralization in the papacy. And it has also contributed to what I call an oracular notion of the papacy, like the Oracle of Delphi. That
I like that, yeah.
Every word that comes out of the Oracle of Delphi's mouth is supposedly, a channeled message from one of the gods, and you can get prophecy and so on. And there has crept into Catholicism over the past century this notion that when something comes out of the Pope's mouth, it's golden, baby. That's an oracle from God. And yet there are very strict limitations that the Church places on the magisterial authority of papal comments. Certainly, for example, statements from Pope Francis, his off-the-cuff comments on airplane interviews.
On airplanes, exactly. It's always on an airplane, Larry.
I know. They mean nothing magisterially. Yeah. Nothing. They're just the private opinion of a single Catholic man. Jorge Bergoglio on an airplane. That's all it is. But when he speaks as Pope Francis, the first, in an official magisterial document, well, that's a little bit different. But even magisterial documents have different levels and weights of authority. So, for example, an encyclical has a higher authority than an apostolic exhortation. And Pope Francis seems to love apostolic exhortations more than encyclicals. I don't know. Although his encyclicals are good, I think. I think they're better than his exhortations. But all that being said, synodality is not a bad thing. Vatican II sort of called for it, and it sort of remained an unfinished business. Pope John Paul and Pope Benedict, but John Paul in particular, probably wanted to institute some more synodal process in the church, but given all of the turmoil that was in the church, all of the dissent and the theological, I lived through the silly season of the post-conciliar church, and let me tell you, folks, it was chaos. It was craziness, and I think John Paul understood that at that moment in the church's history, it needed a firm hand from Rome in order to right and steady the ship. And this raises a good point. A friend of mine, Father Dozier, who's an Eastern Rite Catholic priest, has pointed out, and he's a big fan of the synodal concept of the church and shared authority. But he has pointed out, you can only have proper synodality in the church when you have a healthy church. Then it can work, then it can operate. When there's sap in the tree, when there's blood in the veins, and there's life and faith in the church, then you can share and diffuse authority. But when it's kooky time, All right. When it's la la land out there, you need a firm hand from Rome. And I think that's why John Paul didn't go down the path of synodality. No, Pope Francis is making the adjudication. Now's the time. We're going to talk about synodality again. My problem with it is, number one, I don't think it's the time.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's still the silly season in a lot of ways. But second, I'm not certain what Pope Francis is really up to here. I'm going to be blunt about it. How do you claim that you're in favor of a synodal church that's inclusive and diverse and open-minded, and then issue Traditionis Custodes, which essentially smacks down an entire wing of the church, the traditional Latin Mass movement, all because there were a few malcontents in that movement who said some nasty things about Pope Francis? I hope he's not that thin-skinned, that he suppresses an entire legitimate movement within the church, a movement that was instilled by Pope Benedict, his predecessor, in Summorum Pontificum, that allowed a wider use of the traditional Latin Mass. How is that inclusive? How is that accompaniment? How is that, promoting diversity? How is that going to the peripheries, and reaching out to the marginalized people in the church? Instead, it is a purely juridical act of raw papal authority to suppress an element of the church that the Pope simply doesn't like. Even though, and this is key, there are many, many, many bishops in the church who want the traditional Latin Mass in their parishes, who like the traditional Latin Mass movement, were supporters of the traditional Latin Mass movement. Okay, now these are bishops. And in a synodal church, there is shared authority with bishops. But Pope Francis has essentially said, for example, say to the American episcopacy, you need to put these people down. I mean, so much so, in fact, look, in the dubia answers from Traditionis Custodes, there's even a clause in there that says parishes may not advertise any longer in their parish bulletins the times of traditional Latin Mass. Okay, fine. But notice what we have here. Maybe for the first time in the history of the church, you have a Roman congregation micromanaging what can go into a church bulletin all over the world.
Right.
On something as innocuous as announcing the time of a Mass that is taking place. So this is hardly synodal. And so it raises a lot of fears in the minds of more conservative Catholics, such as myself, that maybe this is just a subterfuge. Maybe this is just a way of sneaking a German-style liberalization of the church in through the back door. And then saying, hey, we went through a democratic process, a more synodal process, and here we are. People want XYZ, and we're going to give them XYZ. I don't know if that's true, but it's a deeply held suspicion from a lot of people. All I know is it smacks to me of something fake and something that is just a bit of a ruse. I'm not excited about it.
No, completely agree, Larry. I think we talked before about, one of our main complaints, main frustrations about Traditionis Custodes is that it seems to be a rather sort of ham-fisted use of the church's sometimes authoritarian tendencies. I'm thinking back to our conversation from last March, maybe last May. It's called the Constantinian Bargain. And you and I talked about the church's Constantinian Bargain and how often we get the church gets too comfortable with state power, gets too cozy with state power. And one of the downsides of that is that the church ends up sort of mimicking the state rather than being something other. Rather than being something that the state can emulate and learn from, the church ends up sort of appropriating what the state has. I think the most discouraging thing to me as an American Catholic now is that I see in both the Synod on Synodality and in the Traditionis Custodes, I see some of the worst aspects of today's culture reflected, and I say that in the sense that there's a sort of a tendency to use authoritarian methods to achieve an end that is perhaps not prudent, while at the same time proclaiming, we're actually all about listening and inclusivity. Yeah. And so in the chat here of our YouTube, I posted the USCCB tweet that Larry was just talking about a few minutes ago, where it says, here are our 7 things that we're thinking about for the Synod: innovative outlook, inclusivity, open-mindedness, listening. I saw someone repost this, and I thought this has to be a parody. This cannot be an actual.
I thought it was from the Babylon Bee or something like that. Exactly. I really did. From the Onion, for crying out loud. I mean, it's a parody of itself.
Yeah. So while they're saying that,
it's like I went to sleep and I woke up and it was 1975 all over
yeah,
again.
precisely. So while they're saying that, Supich, they're saying we're going to be innovative and inclusive and open-minded and listen and accompany. They're saying all those things, and then Cardinal Supich in Chicago, one of the highest-ranking American cardinals, is going beyond Traditionis Custodes and suppressing the Latin Mass in his diocese. And so there's this sort of crackdown, this we'll call it sort of woke crackdown, accompanied with this completely hollow woke rhetoric of inclusivity and open-mindedness and listening. It's terrible.
Not only is Supich clamping down on the traditional Latin Mass in a way that goes beyond traditiones, he's also clamping down on even certain things among Novus Ordo parishes, like there were priests that wanted to pray ad orientem, and were doing so, but now they can no longer do that. So
not allowed.
Yeah, he's even reaching into the Novus Ordo parishes that are trying to do the Novus Ordo in more traditional ways and saying, no, you can't do that either. So it's very clear there's an ideology at work here that is not open, not inclusive, not any of those things at all. It's about closing down conversation rather than opening conversation. I mean, you got a church in Chicago like St. Canisius, right, that was a Latin Mass parish that was busting at the seams. It had gorgeous liturgies, and there was no dissent against Vatican II or any of that nonsense going on there. But they now have to shut all that down, and it's just a crying shame. Why? Why do they have to shut that down? Yeah. It's the most anti-synodal thing imaginable. So to me, it is a form of Catholic wokeism, and this is what's kind of scary. Anybody that's ever worked in the corporate world, and I did briefly.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, exactly. Apologies to anybody, or condolences to anybody that's had to do that. The fact is, this, I hate to it does smack of a certain corporate human resources gobbledygook speak, of that wants to foster a groupthink mentality that is something that the top wants to impose, but doesn't dare do it, and it's just a diktat from on high. So you arrange the deck chairs in such a way that you give the appearance of democracy, you give the appearance of conversation and dialogue, but it's all micromanaged in advance to produce exactly the results that you want it to produce. And so I have no hope that the Synodal Church, for example, is going to come out with a ringing endorsement of bringing back the traditional Latin Mass in various places. No, it's probably going to be the opposite. And by the way, I'm not here to be a huge champion of the traditional Latin Mass. I don't attend a TLM parish or any of those sorts of things. And so, it's not like I'm here as an apologist for that movement, but I have so many friends that are in the movement, and it means...
You're just being inclusive, Larry.
Yeah, I am being inclusive. That's me.
The call of the USCCB.
I'm Mr. Inclusive, right? And I've been very critical of those negative elements in the traditionalist movement. In my blog, Gaudium at Spes22.com, I've had numerous blog posts that has cost me subscribers, right, against the traditionalist excesses, against Vatican II and calling Pope Francis a heretic.
Yeah.
But that doesn't change the fact that most traditionalists are not that, and they're just ordinary men and women. And I'll say this too, I'm going to come back. I think one of the things that attracts a lot of people to the traditional Latin Mass parishes is also what attracts me to the Ordinariate parish that I attend. Mm-hmm. And it's the community. The liturgy is almost a kind of bonus. Oh, it's a beautiful liturgy, the Latin Mass, or the Ordinariate is a beautiful liturgy, Ordinariate liturgy. When, in point of fact, what families are looking for, parents are looking for their families, is a safe haven from the cultural septic tank that normal Catholic suburban parishes do not preserve them from. Okay, or Catholic schools don't preserve their children from the cultural septic tank in which we live. And so they seek out these intentional smaller communities of faith to help them raise their children. And this is a severe blow, in my mind, against families, against parents, Catholic devoted parents who want to raise their children in the faith. And it's a huge slap down to them, and it's I don't want this whole broadcast to sort of foray off into that. But
I do have a couple other questions too.
Sure, go ahead.
Topic. So real quick, I told PX I would ask this. He just said a real quick question. Have you seen anything from your local diocese on the synod listening sessions? I have not, but also I just moved to the Archdiocese of Chicago. It's probably happening here, but I'm not super clued in. I'm also attending an Eastern church anyway, so I'm even less sort of involved in the sort of communiques from the archdiocese. But how about you, Larry? Anything in your diocese?
Well, I'm kind of in a similar state.
Yeah.
I attend an Anglican Ordinariate parish, and we're not a part of the Diocese of Scranton. We're part of the Ordinariate Diocese, which is a non-territorial diocese. And so, yeah, we don't get a lot of the diocesan communications. It might be going on in some parishes, but I have to say I haven't seen evidence of it.
Yeah.
I have no Catholic I run into at the supermarket is talking. It's not the water cooler buzz amongst
Not at all.
Catholics,
Yeah,
not
zero.
at all. And isn't that indicative of something? I mean, seriously, who's going to get excited about a synod on synodality, where we get together and share our thoughts on inclusion?
Right.
People want to break from all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, my back to the question of whether or not you're optimistic about the synod on synodality. I think there is less reason to be pessimistic than many are, precisely for that reason, Larry. People just aren't excited about it, and it's I think it's going to ultimately go nowhere. We've got a question here from Sean Dooley, who, based on this question, he says, as a priest, so I'm guessing this is a father, Sean Dooley. He says, thanks for your posts. I've been reading more from Bouyer and Morin. That's Louis Bouyer and
Peter Morin. Yeah.
As a priest, I ask, what is an effective homily in the church today? What have been the pros and cons of homiletics since Vatican II? This is a great question that I'm totally unqualified to answer, Larry, so I'm glad he directed this to you. What do you think?
Well, that's a great question. It's caught me a little bit off guard here. I can only say that I did spend 20 years as a college professor and 4 years before that as a prep school teacher. And so in some ways, it's a similar sort of situation where you're trying, and I was a theology professor, so I'm trying to communicate the faith to a mixed group of people at various levels of spiritual discernment. And you're trying to get them on fire for Christ, for the church, and all those kinds of things. And the only thing that I can say is that in my own experience, the most effective homilies are very, very similar to the most effective classes that I taught. And that is to avoid stock phrases, stock answers, to avoid. I mean, there's nothing wrong with getting catechetical in a homily, but if all homilies are the dry bones repetition of catechisms, statements, or whatever, it's not going to go very far, because a lot of the people in the pews need to be re-evangelized more than they really need to be re-catechized. In other words, they need to know why the catechism is important in the first place before you teach them the catechism. But beyond that, too, a lot of homilies don't focus on the catechism. They don't focus on even evangelizing. A lot of homilies just focus on very simplistic forms of exegeting the scripture passages for that day. And I think one of the mistakes that homilists make is trying to distill down scripture passages to leave the people with a little nugget, a sort of takeaway, a bromide, an aphorism, something that they can sort of pin on their refrigerator door mentally and say, okay, that's the moral of the story.
Right.
Because usually what happens in those kinds of homilies, the moral ends up being very benign, very banal, very ordinary, something that you would get from any church. It's nice to be nice to the nice.
It's Hallmark stuff.
Exactly. And so I'm sure Father knows exactly what I'm talking about. I think there's a fine line, and one has to be careful not to offend. But I think homilies these days need to be blunt. And I think priests need to be intelligent, educated. They need to read. Nobody's going to be a good homilist unless they read. So Father's reading Bouyer, Peter Morin, which sounds like he's a guy who likes books. He's a guy who likes theology, he likes to read. So I'm sure his homilies are great. But, nemo dat quod non habet. You cannot give what you do not have. And a priest who doesn't have theological education or insight isn't going to have insight into the culture. My best classes as a teacher took place when I deconstructed the culture, when I exposed the lies of our culture. And I think more homilies need to do that, to expose the lies that are inherent in our culture. In other words, we need to be about flipping the script, flipping the narrative, the script that is in people's brains that are sitting out there in the pews. And that script is not getting flipped. That narrative is not getting changed. The message of the gospel has got to be seen in all of its revolutionary, cutting-edge sharpness, without being obnoxious or anything like that. I'm not talking fire and brimstone. I'm talking about getting to the essence of the gospel, getting to its core evangelical power and truth, and preaching it in season and out, and letting the chips fall where they may as you criticize the surrounding culture in the process. I think people are thirsty for that. I think a
Definitely.
good homily, too, engages in mystagogy. I think people are also extremely thirsty for the spiritual, for the mystical. And the church has this rich, rich mystical tradition, monastic tradition, spiritual life tradition. And I've seen a lot of effective homilies where the priest discusses the stages of the spiritual life, the stages of mysticism, the stages of supernatural experience. People want to hear about the supernatural. So many homilies are so horizontalist today, focusing on love of neighbor and all that kind of stuff, which is great, but there's so little verticality in homilies these days, so little emphasis on the inbreaking of the supernatural into our lives. I
Yeah.
heard a great homily a couple months ago by a priest that was talking about, a dream that he had, and he believed that it was a communication from God, and it wasn't weird at all. It was very powerful, And in the New Testament, God speaks to people in dreams, and little things like that, letting people know that the supernatural is there in their lives on a day-to-day basis. I have found is extremely, extremely powerful. As a homiletic tool. I know that answer is kind of all over the map, but those are my suggestions.
That's great, Larry. The only thing I'll add as someone who's not taught at the university level or ever given a homily in the liturgical setting, obviously, I can only speak from the perspective of someone in the pews. The homilies that I love are ones that really unpack the scriptures as well.
Yeah, you have to do that.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is don't remain there.
Yeah, no, totally. I'm agreeing with you. I'm agreeing.
Yeah.
I'm just adding that additional particular point of emphasis to unpack the richness of the scriptures, because I think so often Catholics sit in the pews, including myself, and we sit through all of the readings and are paying attention a little bit here and there, maybe tuning out entirely, and then having someone unpack all that for us is super helpful and powerful, and that gets at some of the mystagogy that you're talking about, Larry.
Oh yeah, Lives of the Saints too are good.
Yes, oh for sure. We've got Bobby Mixon in the chat. He's got a question about Charles Taylor that we'll get to, but first I want to get to this one from Bossman37, who says he's a seminarian. He read your recent article on married clergy, and for listeners who are tuning in, Larry wrote a long reflection on clerical celibacy, calling for its abolition. I'm just kidding, Larry.
I was going to say, wait a minute, wait.
He wrote a long reflection explicitly saying, "I'm not calling for the abolition of it, but this is I think you called it an extended meditation."
That's all it was. Yeah.
On the discipline of priestly celibacy. And so this seminarian says, "I'm a seminarian who considers himself well-adjusted. I see my call to give up the married state as a cross, but one fashioned by God to build up his church. In your article, it sounds like seeing it as a cross, if it is indeed difficult for someone, is a dangerous conflict. Can you clarify?" And then he says, "I've got reading to do for class, so I won't see the answer live, but he can tune in later and check it out." So what do you say to that question, Larry?
I think it's a great question, and I think it's one of the actual flaws in my blog post, which I edited and added onto in order to address that very point. I have a very good friend, I don't want to mention his name, who's a Catholic journalist, and you would recognize his name, who I'm friends with, and he wrote to me and says, "Yeah, Larry, I get your point that unless celibacy is a charism that you have been gifted with by God, then you need to think twice about the priesthood. That's all well, true, and good. But it is also possible to lead a celibate life simply out of a holy obedience to the church and her discipline, even if you don't feel called to celibacy in particular." And so I added that caveat in there. So I think this seminarian is exactly right. Celibacy should only be embraced by a man who could actually see himself being a biological father as well, a married man. A person who felt no capacity for marriage should never become a priest either, a celibate priest either. You can't exercise spiritual fatherhood if you're not capable of regular fatherhood. And so the desire to get married is certainly healthy. And you may not be explicitly called to celibacy. you might not also be explicitly called to marriage, but one way or the other, you're simply in holy obedience, acquiescing to the church's rule here. And holiness can be found in that. My remarks were actually, my harsher remarks were geared more towards my own experience in the seminary and meeting men, quite a few, actually, who I didn't feel were called to celibacy, and I didn't feel they were called to marriage either. I don't think they had any charism of any particular note, and that they were just entering the priesthood because they enjoyed its lifestyle perks.
Yeah.
And this was an altogether bad thing, as we ended up seeing. All that being said, I do want to still reiterate that central point in my blog, that celibacy had better at some point become a charism. Even if you don't feel explicitly called to celibacy, in order to embrace it, even as a cross, you have got to eventually see it as a charism, the grace for which God is giving you. Otherwise, your cross is simply going to be a white-knuckled asceticism that's going to potentially lead towards sublimated forms of carnal substitution, right? And that's why you see many alcoholic priests, many obese priests, not to mention, porn-addicted priests, and so on. Okay, and that's not a majority of them, but that's there. So my argument is that we need to think about making celibacy optional in order for the charism, the true charism of celibacy, to come forward with more force, to be a true charism in the church and not simply holy obedience. I don't want a priesthood 95% filled with men who are just being obedient. I want men who have actually embraced celibacy as a calling. I know what the caveat that the seminarian is raising, and it's a good one. But at the end of the day, I think we need to really emphasize celibacy as a charism. Otherwise, you're going to run into trouble.
I appreciate those comments. Hopefully, those are helpful to the commenter who is asking.
By the way, and God bless the young man, if he is a young man.
Yeah, I was just about to say that
for his gift, for his gifting of himself to the church.
Yeah, exactly. I was about to say the same exact thing, Larry. Your article caught me off guard, and I'm still sort of processing your meditations, as you call them. It's not very often that people in our theological circles publish something like that sort of challenges a sort of presupposition like that. In this case, clerical celibacy. But one example of, I think, what you're talking about is this priest named Father Michael O'Loughlin, who has a podcast called What God Is Not. It's called that because of the Eastern Church's emphasis on apophatic theology.
Right.
He is an Eastern Rite church. He's actually technically Ruthenian Rite, but is a pastor of a Byzantine Catholic church in Los Angeles. And as you know, Larry, the Eastern churches do not have the rule of clerical celibacy.
No.
But Father Michael is not married, and he's not married because, as he was discerning this, he really did sort of discern this charism to celibacy.
There you go.
And so he said, you know what? I am not required to be celibate, but I'm choosing to be celibate. And I've sort of thought about that a lot since I first heard him say it a couple of years ago. But hearing or reading your meditation makes me think about this in a different way. So let's go to now Bobby Mixa, who is in the chat. Bobby says, I know Larry has some problems with Charles Taylor.
Hang on a second.
Oh, no worries.
Oh, geez. Oh, no.
FaceTime ringing on your computer?
Yes, my wife is FaceTiming me. My apologies. But she doesn't know I'm at a different location. She's someplace else.
No
and
worries.
She's going to bed. She's FaceTiming me. She doesn't know I'm doing this. But anyway, my apologies for that. So anyway, go ahead. Go ahead with Bobby's question.
Yeah, Bobby says, Bobby Mixa here. I know Larry has some problems with Charles Taylor. Tell me the problems. And that's it. So what are the problems with Charles Taylor?
Oh, well, thanks for that, Robert, for the very I'm no expert on Charles Taylor. I just think that he has some very, very powerful insights into, things like the buffered self, the social imaginary, the rise of the disenchanted culture in which we live, which has been perhaps replaced by some lesser enchantments and all that. And I think it's all brilliant stuff. I just wish that he had tied it all together into a more positive and prescriptive proposal of some kind at the end. I mean, his book is almost entirely, well, the secular age, a secular age, is almost entirely diagnostics. You know, a massive tome of diagnostics, which is great. We need that, and it's one of the most brilliant diagnostics out there. And everybody involved in that issue today has got to be conversant with Charles Taylor. Nonetheless, I think at the end it sort of short circuits, it sort of fizzles. I was, when I was reading A Secular Age, I was hoping at the end he would say, and here's my idea of what we need to do to ameliorate that. And I was hoping that he would draw in Christian resources in particular, Catholic resources, and saying, sort of along the lines of a Christopher Dawson.
I love Dawson. Yeah,
or even I'm recently reading Jean Daniel, the Jesuit, Ressourcement theologian Daniel Lou's little tiny book called Prayer as a Political Problem. And Dawson and Daniel Lou are dealing with the same issue of how do we create a Christian civilization when Christianity is no longer a viable force in our society. And that's why you end up with Rod Dreher's Benedict option and things like that. And so that's kind of what I was looking for a little bit more of out of Charles Taylor as well, which is, as Alasdair MacIntyre said, we're waiting for a new Saint Benedict to come along, albeit a very different one. And I was just hoping that there would have been more in that direction from Charles Taylor. So it's actually a very mild criticism that I have of Taylor. I just actually reread A Secular Age. Well, actually, I didn't reread the whole thing. I went back and reread large chunks of it. Let's put it that way. So, hang on a second. Hang just 1 second.
No worries. Well, Bobby,
Okay.
hopefully that answers the question about Larry's problems with Charles Taylor. Larry, we are almost out of time. I was shooting for this to be 45 minutes long. We're at 52 minutes and counting. So as we wrap up, how about this? How about you just mentioned some of the books that you've been reading, Daniel Liu, and rereading parts of A Secular Age. But what else is on your book stand at night? What things are you? What spiritual readings do you have going on, or theological examinations, etc.?
This wonderful book here, Freedom, Truth, and Human Dignity, which is a great book on my next blog post is going to be on Dignitatis Humanae, the Vatican II document that dealt with religious freedom. And it was the most deeply controversial of all the conciliar. Forget Sacrosanctum Concilium, forget the liturgical renewal, forget Dei Verbum, forget all of that. The most controversial document of Vatican II was the Declaration on religious freedom, Dignitatis Humanae.
Yeah,
it's the number one aspect of the Second Vatican Council that people like Archbishop Lefebvre, the SSPX, the Archtraditionalists, that they all reject. That this opened the door to religious relativism and indifferentism and so on.
The one that Athanasius Schneider today always cites.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And every single bishop that trends extremely right-wing has big issues with Dignitatis Humanae. And so I think, number one, that they're wrong to be opposed to religious freedom, especially in the manner in which Dignitatis articulates it. So this book here, there's a huge section in here by David L. Schindler of the JP2 Institute in Washington and editor of Communio, the English edition, American edition, I should say, of Communio. And Nicholas Healy Jr., who teaches at the Institute in Washington, too. Some wonderful stuff in there where they go through the whole history of the development of Dignitatis Humanae, all of the debates, all of the various schemas, everything that went down to give a full picture of the significance of this document and why it really is necessary to pay attention to. And the end of the book then has all of the various drafts, pre-drafts, the schemata, as they're called, for Dignitatis Humanae. Many of the interventions, some of the interesting interventions, for example, from Karol Wojtyła, later Pope John Paul II. were very instrumental in Dignitatis. So that's what I'm doing, and that's the main thing I'm reading, and I highly recommend it as a book to anyone. And I'm
Can you
just
hold that up one more time? What's the title of it?
Freedom, Truth, and Human Dignity. Now, it's not for the faint of heart.
Sure.
I mean, it would not be something that an ordinary, non-theologically educated person would read.
Yeah,
This is the book by Daniel Liu, Prayer as a Political Problem. That is highly accessible to almost anyone. And it's a very small book, as you can see. I think it's great. And I also just reread, I know you'll appreciate this, Diary of a Country Priest by George Bernanos.
Right.
It's my spiritual discipline. I reread that book once every year. I just finished rereading it. It's great.
The Daniel Liu book, the background image of that is the Angelus by Jean-Francois Millet. Beautiful little portrait. That's only a portion of it. That's the woman praying in the field. Her husband is alongside her in the rest of the photograph, and you see the church, the French church spire in the background.
Yes,
it's one of my favorite paintings, and that actually graces the sort of front room of our home right now, right above where the piano will go when we get that in here. So
very good. And my apologies for all the FaceTime interruptions.
No worries at all. No worries at all. So this is what I've got up next on the docket, Larry. Little von Balthasar, The Christian and Anxiety.
Oh, yes. Yes.
So I'll have to ask you about that one. Maybe we can talk about it when I finish it. I'm also rereading Merton's 7-Story Mountain. So that's what's my spiritual reading these days.
That's a great book. Both are great books.
Yeah, indeed. Well, to our listeners, thanks so much for tuning in. Really appreciate it, engaging with all the questions. Let us know if there are additional questions that you wanted answered, but we didn't get to. You can send me a note, Zach@credopodcast.com. Zach, just Z-A-C, no H, Zach@credopodcast.com. By the way, Father Sean in the chat, Larry just says, Diary of a Country Priest. Wow, reading it now. Yeah.
Yes.
Father Sean, we did a podcast on this 2, maybe 3 months ago now, Larry and I, all about Diary of a Country Priest. It's probably my favorite podcast we've ever done, Larry. Really enjoyed diving into that with you and all the, because I read that book, Father Sean, I read that book 4 months ago or so. And I describe it as a life-changing book, and it is definitely in my top 5.
And I wish there were more podcasts of these positive things, in the church, because we're constantly, I'm guilty as the next person, right, talking about all the topical stuff, all the controversy that's swirling around, but there's such great beauty in the church.
Yeah, there really is. We should do another podcast like that, Larry. We just take a book and dissect it. So,
absolutely,
that's a good idea. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. To my listeners, like I said, shoot me a note, Zach, Z-A-C, @credopodcast.com. If there's a question that you wanted us to get to, but we were not able to, would love to hear from you. Love hearing from listeners, and we'll get back to you whenever I can, or I'll forward the question on to Larry if it is one that he can better answer, which would be most of them. And stay tuned. Hit subscribe on this channel if you want to be notified when we do this again, because we will do it again. And if you don't already know, Larry does a monthly show with me on this podcast. So, as always, Larry, pleasure to have you. Thanks so much for doing this.
You too, Zach. Good talking to you.
All right. And to my listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time, God bless you.